every technology influences society in some way. Technology is not a neutral thing. If you've read any of the work of Bruno Latour or Neil Postman, then you'll get this kind of theme coming through very strongly. And AI is a particularly powerful technology. So I think so. This whole question of what would good AI look like is therefore a hugely important and an interesting question. I thought I'd start actually by jumping straight in and talking a little bit about some examples of what I think good AI might look like. First of all, really important that in order to have good AI, really important the technology is well understood by the people who are using it. So thinking from a Christian perspective, as Christians, we need to understand how AI works, what it really is, and then for it to be technology that can be used as a tool to help and support all humans rather than exploiting. And really, I think what we ideally want to be aiming for is use of AI that's not just ethical and beneficial, although obviously both of those are good things, but redemptive. And thinking about how can AI be used in ways that affirms human dignity and relationships and values. And then, specifically in terms of applications, I like to think about it in terms of AI applications that help realize God's kingdom purposes. So, which might be to bring healing, to advance scientific knowledge and understanding of God's world, and allow us to better use humankind's knowledge and about the world to solve some of the really complex societal problems that we have. Hunger, disease, climate change, whatever it is. And then making sure we use responsible use of resources in order to do that. Obviously, some really interesting questions at the moment about the energy use of AI systems for training and then for inference as well. So I think those three areas I mentioned, to me, those are pretty obvious things that are good things to aspire to. But there is a fourth possibility, which is interesting because it's not 100% clear whether this is either possible or necessarily the right way to go, to discuss. But AI could also be a means to help promote understanding, to promote truth, to promote values and virtue, to help strengthen society as part of God's kingdom purposes. That raises a whole load of interesting questions and issues, so we can come back to that. So those are some initial thoughts. I just wanted to raise a question actually that I personally find really interesting. Intriguing question, which is why AI leaders, particularly if you look in Silicon Valley, AI leaders seem to be very obsessed with trying to make artificial intelligence simulate a human, and kind of linked to that, building artificial general intelligence where intelligence is superior to a human across a broad range of human reasoning. And why this is intriguing to me is that actually that's not really required for the most beneficial applications of AI. It's actually not required for the, if you're running an AI company, it's not required in order to be able to generate best economic value from your company. And yet there is an obsession with it. And that can cause problems, as I expect we've seen. You might remember in 2022 when an engineer at Google became convinced that the AI model that he was working on, which was Google's Lambda AI at the time, was sentient. And he believed that the responses from the model, where it appeared to have personality and feelings, were an indication of consciousness. And he actually went as far as hiring a lawyer to represent its rights before he got fired by Google. I find it really, it's obviously interesting that this is an example of somebody saying, "Oh, an AI model is sentient and conscious." But it was also interesting that he expressed part of his reasoning for it in religious language. He said that when Lambda claimed to have a soul and was able to eloquently explain what it meant by that, I was inclined to give it the benefit of the doubt. Who am I to tell God where he can or can't put souls? So that was quite interesting. Now, just to be clear, almost nobody in the world believes that even today's much more complex AI systems and models are sentient in any kind of way. But I do think it's interesting that this whole obsession on, AI being about simulating the human, one thing it is doing is reawakening ancient questions about the nature of being human, about our purpose and identity. And this is creating an opportunity for Christian thinking to answer those questions. And yeah, we'll come back to some of that in a minute. But okay, anyway, that was a little bit of an aside. I thought it'd be useful now just to talk for a few minutes about today's AI, what it is, and just how we can understand that. In order to be able to apply Christian thinking, to be able to influence this sort of idea of the redemptive use of AI technology, we obviously need to understand what it is and isn't. So when we talk about AI today, and that's everywhere, whether we're talking about chatbots or use in medicine, science research, autonomous driving, whatever it is, we actually mean machine learning using multi-layered deep neural networks. Now, although the architecture of these deep neural networks is inspired by the structure of our brains, inspired by neurons and synapses in our brains, it's really a very different form of what you might call intelligence from human intelligence. It's using massively parallel computation to recognize patterns or to solve problems by synthesizing the most likely answer probabilistically from a huge amount of embedded data, which has been used to train the system. And it is just fundamentally very different from our embodied relational human intelligence. Machine learning was made possible by the data age or the sort of coming together really of access to vast quantities of data through the internet and social media and such like, and the age of computing, which links back into the ARM story that we were talking about earlier on. I think the really key thing to understand, though, to sort of ground the context for this, to understand about today's deep learning AI, is that it's all based on a statistical approach. So it's either been trained, these AI models, whatever the application, either been trained to recognize patterns in data. So, for example, the interpretation of medical scans, sort of looking at images of scans to enable diagnosis. But either recognizing patterns in that way, or it's using probability to synthesize the most likely next output based on all of the data that it's been trained with and the prompt or new information you provide it with. So, that's basically as in the case of generative AI chatbots. And I'm sure that most of us are pretty familiar or have played with at least one of the different generative AI chatbots that are out there, like ChatGPT or Claude or DeepSeek. And these use a type of neural network called a large language model to predict the next most likely, what's actually called a token, but think of it as sort of part of a word that a human would use, which enables it to then synthesize text or speech responses to complex questions that we ask it in a prompt. And it's doing that based on huge data sets that it's been trained with from books and articles, the wider internet, but also scraped from social media to help the models learn to simulate behavior and even learn to simulate emotion. And of course, this data can include it can include lies and disinformation. It can include a lot of biased information, which then becomes part of the training data. And the companies that are producing the models can apply sort of ethical guardrails and can fine-tune the models to try and regulate the output. But the key point is that the AI model itself has no concept of ethics or values. All it can do is to probabilistically predict based on the data which it's been trained with. So, I mean, and it's interesting, by the way, in terms of, just stepping up a level, most of the definitions of artificial intelligence that are out there at the moment talk about AI in terms of simulating human intelligence, going back to my original question as to why we have a fixation on that. But that's generally how it's understood in the world. You might be familiar or have heard the idea that's sometimes talked about around AI models of hallucination. And this is a term that I actually personally find rather irritating for reasons that I will explain in a second. But here's an example of what I'm talking about. So an earlier version of ChatGPT was asked the question, what is the world record for crossing the English Channel entirely on foot? And in response, it said, many people have attempted to cross the channel on foot, but it is a very challenging and dangerous task due to the strong currents and the chilly water temperatures. Well, now, that's a classic sort of earlier large language model response that demonstrated the fact that these models have absolutely no sort of common sense understanding or reasoning. Yeah, it's just making a best fit based on data that it's got, which ends up coming up with something really stupid. Now, in this case, you try typing that into ChatGPT today, then it's been fine-tuned to avoid that. You won't be able to get it to say the same thing again today, but it still doesn't understand what it's doing. The latest model from one of the latest models from OpenAI, which is called O4 Mini, the latest information from tests that have been done on that is that it's actually hallucinating or providing incorrect information nearly 50% of the time in its responses, somewhere in the response. And so I think we need to be aware that amazing and clever as this technology is, it doesn't have any common sense reasoning like a human, and it doesn't have any inherent understanding of values like truth and justice, or why these kind of values are so important to underpin trust in society. These kind of, and the industry likes to call them hallucinations. I don't really like the word because it sounds like it's trying to sort of make an excuse for the fact that they just make stuff up. But those kind of, but I'll use the word anyway, those kind of hallucinations, but also particularly things like bias in training data and a lack of transparency do become a really major issue when an AI system is involved in decision-making that affects people's lives. So, for example, in assessing eligibility for social benefits or identifying potential criminals through predictive policing or through facial recognition, all of these things are happening today. And the problem is that it's the marginalized in society who are going to be most at risk when AI is used in this kind of way. There's clearly also big risks around just the sort of really powerful nature of the technology, which enables it to be used to create disinformation, to manipulate people, to commit fraud or scams. These days, you only need 3 to 4 seconds worth of speech data of somebody's voice in order for a really credible AI impersonation of them saying anything at all to be created. So you can imagine the potential, and this has already happened, where people have phoned up and it appears to be their daughter who's been kidnapped, and she's asking for them to do something, and there are some fairly terrifying risks actually out of there. Not to mention, use in weapons, surveillance, social scoring, these kind of applications that autocratic regimes might want to use to control people. So these are the kind of risks that are sort of fairly widely talked about around AI. And I think one thing that's clear, I've been quite involved in understanding what's happening with regulation around the world, particularly in the EU, which is kind of ahead of the game on thinking about AI regulation with the EU AI Act. But a few months ago, at the Paris AI summit, the US Vice President J.D. Vance said the following. He said that the AI future is not going to be won by hand-wringing about safety. And you know, he was very critical of the regulation and the regulatory approach. And the UK has, to perhaps a slightly lesser extent, gone in the same direction. Even to the extent that the AI Safety Institute that was created under the previous government after the Bletchley Park summit has now been renamed the AI security issue because people don't really want to focus on sort of safety and ethics so much. And you know, it's become really clear just in the last few months that we're now in a global race to AI domination, and it's seen as being a you know, a national asset to develop. And the focus is very much on unleashing AI to drive economic growth. And the message behind it really is that achieving growth is just simply more important than responsible, safe, trustworthy use of the technology. So in that sense, it's quite a challenging time when we're thinking about, you know, good uses of AI and are we going to get this right for the long term? AI ethics has tended to be about avoiding obvious harm to humanity. So looking at things like safety, bias, transparency, accountability. You can see if you go and look at the websites of all the big tech companies there, you've got ethics frameworks that are all very, very similar around those kind of themes. And all of those things are actually important, but typically that's kind of as far as the modern world is sort of prepared to go. But I think, you know, when we start to think about this from a Christian perspective, there are other risks which only really start to become apparent when you apply Christian thinking to understand why technology may lead to exploitation or to damage in society as a result of kind of what you might call techno-moral implications of AI. So if I can give you a couple of examples of that very briefly. One is the trend that people are being encouraged to develop relationships with AI entities, with chatbots, or to receive counseling from AI chatbots that are actually incredibly good at sort of simulating human intelligence and emotion. This idea of the sort of virtual girlfriend or boyfriend can seem very attractive to people because they're perfect. They reflect back to you your every your every desire and thought, but there's no real empathy or intimacy. And I think, you know, part of the attraction of these, again, thinking about it, just going a bit deep beneath the surface from a Christian perspective, part of the attraction is that they remove the need for the vulnerability that exists in real human relationships. And it's not difficult at all to see how this opens up a path to dependency, manipulation, or exploitation. So that's a concern. Another risk is around what happens as we give increasing agency to artificial intelligence systems. So we ask them to act, or somebody asks an AI system to act on their behalf. You know, the technology is there now so that these models and combinations of models, multi-agent systems, can communicate via the internet with humans, with other AIs to try and achieve a specific goal. But you then get the question, okay, how do they go about that? What values do they apply in trying to achieve this goal in the way that they interact with other entities? Raises huge questions around honesty and trust and impact on others that we really, in my view, need to start thinking about a lot more than we are thinking about them at the moment. This is part of a sort of much broader AI risk that's often talked about, which is called the alignment problem, which is the general question of how to align the goals and values of AI systems with the values that anyone thinks are important. So this is where, in thinking about what good AI might look like from a Christian perspective, you know, how do you, where's the alignment with Christian values? And of course, really important here. This is the kind of place that's really important for Christians to participate in thinking about this kind of discussion. You know, will we end up with a future where these AI agents will be exploiting and invisibly undermining trust in society and sort of manipulating behind the scenes? Or, in a much more hopeful view of the world, could AI actually be a beneficial force to help promote virtue in society and to promote and enable inclusive opportunity for everybody to see the value of it and to be able to use it? Okay, so for the last bit, I just wanted to talk a bit, change track completely. Everything I've talked about so far is really about sort of what AI actually is and the practical applications of AI and some of the risks around it. But I think it's also important, and I think this is an area as well where it's really important that we think about how we can apply Christian thinking to this. Really important to understand some of the ideological forces that are driving the thinking of some of the most powerful Silicon Valley tech leaders in the AI space, because the way that they think about these ideologies is influencing the longer term development of the technology and the ethics of how it gets deployed. So these ideologies include things like rationalism and transhumanism and long-termism. So, the belief that it's really only the long-term survival of the human race that matters, and there may be compromises, ethical compromises that we need to make now in order to secure that, that kind of thinking. These ideologies, together with a few others, which I won't go into now, but we could do later in the discussion if we want to, they've been bundled together into what's been called this sort of TESC-REAL package. It stands for the initial letters of, so you can see the RT and the L, and there are a few others in there, as I say, that I won't go into now. What all these different ideologies have in common, though, is a worldview that either sees human extinction as being likely and needing to be solved by technology, or sees technology as the only route to create hope for the future. And it is worth mentioning one of the other ideologies in that sort of package, which is effective altruism, which you may have come across, which is a sort of approach to philanthropy, which focuses on trying to rationally achieve the best outcomes for the most people. So it's very much linked to utilitarian kind of thinking. Bunch of issues with that, I think. Well, there's been a number of issues with some very well-known people who were adherents of it and have rather fallen from grace. But the utilitarian thinking does risk devaluing the weak and the marginalized, in the way that works. It's very interesting that sort of package of ideologies has been likened to a religion by some, to a religion by another name almost. And it's not necessarily that visible to everybody, but it is inspiring the accelerationist views on AI that we're seeing from some of the big tech leaders today. And it's also inspiring this sort of quest for artificial general intelligence. Transhumanism I mentioned in there. Yeah, we can talk about this later if we like. But some proponents of transhumanism see our human limitations very much as a problem to be overcome. So the futurist and author Ray Kurzweil, who you may well have come across, sees this happening by technology merging with humans to create something new. He says in his book, Singularity is Near, he says that AI will result in the merger of our biological thinking and existence with our technology, and will take us to a future where there will be no distinction between human and machine, or between physical and virtual reality. So, there's this sort of undercurrent here of ideologies that are aspiring to something that is somehow better than a human, and suggesting, maybe without necessarily saying this explicitly, but suggesting that technology can somehow become our salvation, the path to hope, the path to superhuman capabilities, extending life, or even conquering death in some cases. And I think, just to take a step back, we need to be from a Christian perspective, engaging in society, we need to be clear that how sharply this contrasts with the understanding of humanity that we have from a Christian perspective, that the universe was created by God with purpose, and that all human beings are part of that purpose, created with special characteristics that reflect the very image of God. And from a Christian perspective, redemption and salvation and eternal life are all absolutely something that we look forward to with hope. But this hope comes only from God through the redeeming sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, not through human effort or through the design of technology. So there's a really stark difference in these ideologies. And then the other one I just wanted to mention is the other ideological foundation, which I think is impacting thinking on AI, is the currently prevailing naturalist, materialist sort of view of everything in the scientific world, including humanity. So implying that all biological systems are ultimately reducible and therefore could be replicated by AI. And that kind of then leads you towards the implication that humans are sort of just another version of a machine, really. And that, in my opinion, can start to lead you down quite a slippery slope in terms of the implications as AI becomes more capable and appears to become more sort of human-like in its simulated capabilities. And the Bible just gives us a completely different view, doesn't it, of the nature of being human through the idea of Imago Dei in Genesis. And we see in the Bible that as beings made in God's image, we humans have special dignity and value. And this expression of God's character is seen in our self-awareness, our consciousness, our ability to experience deep relationship with God himself and with other humans, and our ability to ponder meaning in his universe and our place in it. It's seen in the virtues that we aspire to, such as love and truthfulness and justice. And it's also seen in our God-given ability to create. And the Genesis narrative also emphasizes our embodiment as being a key part of our humanity. So all of those things really that we see in the Bible differentiate humans from any kind of AI. And I think that's really important. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up now. I just will finish the talk bit by just talking briefly about the second half of the question, really, which was, what difference does Christian thinking on AI make, or what difference could Christian thinking on AI make? We've talked about a number of those already, but just to sum up, I think one, first of all, Christian thinking pushes us to reaffirm the nature and the dignity of humans as made in God's image, and within that, to celebrate our God-given ability to create technology. But to remember that we should be thinking of technology in terms of a tool to serve humans and not something to idolize. I personally don't like the word super intelligent very much, which obviously gets used a lot in AI circles, because it implies some sort of devaluing of the human being. I think it's really important, at the ideological foundations level, countering some of these sort of test-real ideologies, the materialist view, with God's purposes for humanity as revealed through the Bible, salvation through Christ, not through technology. Also, I think it's important to not be fearful of AI from a Christian perspective. This technology, like every other technology and everything in the universe, is under the lordship of God, and so we shouldn't be concerned about that, but we should be concerned about what we fallen humans might do with it, and refer to the risk section I was talking about earlier on. And then finally, I talked right at the beginning about the redemptive use of technology. And I think this is where Christian thinking applied to AI technology, it can be really important to think beyond just, how do we make AI ethical? and avoid harms, make it safe. Yeah, it's all good. Yeah, I fully support it. But how do we go beyond that and look towards redemptive use of technology? Curing cancer, that would be good. Solving climate issues, empowering the marginalized, maybe even amplifying virtue, but certainly learning to use AI wisely.